In example 3, we're going to simplify by combining fractions together. So here I have sine x cosine x over 1 minus sine x. And here I have 1 plus sine x over cosine x. First thing I need to do is find a common denominator. This 1 minus sine x, anything that's added or subtracted is grouped together. So that 1 minus sine x is one term, one thing. And then I also have a cosine of x. So my common denominator is going to be a 1 minus sine x times the cosine x. So in the first fraction, if I need to get a cosine x in the denominator, I'm going to multiply the bottom by cosine and the top by cosine. So that first fraction will become sine x cosine squared x over 1 minus sine x times cosine x. So that cosine on the top got multiplied by another cosine, which is why that became cosine squared. Then, in the second fraction, the denominator is missing the 1 minus sine x that I need. So I have to multiply the denominator and the numerator by 1 minus sine x. And I get 1 plus sine x times 1 minus sine x over 1 minus sine x times cosine of x. And then I need to go ahead and multiply this out on the top. If you notice, this is a difference of squares. 1 plus sign, 1 minus sign is a difference of squares. If you don't recognize that, you could multiply it all out and go from there. Or if you recognize it as a difference of squares, it would just become 1 minus sign squared. Again, you can do that work of multiplying off to the side of your work if you need to. So we get sine x cosine squared x over 1 minus sine x cosine x minus 1 minus sine squared x over 1 minus sine x cosine x. And then you should recognize your Pythagorean identities. 1 minus sine squared, that's coming from our sine squared x plus cosine squared x equals 1. And so if we rearrange this Pythagorean identity, 1 minus the sine squared is just going to be the cosine squared. So I have my first fraction, which is sine x cosine squared x over 1 minus sine x cosine x. And I'm going to change, in this next step, I'm going to change the 1 minus sine squared into cosine squared x all over 1 minus sine x cosine x. Now that I've simplified this second fraction, I can go ahead and combine this into one fraction, and I'm subtracting. So what I end up with is sine x cosine squared x minus cosine squared x all over 1 minus sine x times cosine x. Then as I look to simplify, I do have a sine x here and a cosine x here. This cosine and this cosine cannot cancel out because, again, that subtraction sign. You have to only factor out things that you are multiplying together. So what I could do on the top is I can actually factor out a cosine squared since both of these have a cosine squared. So I'm going to go ahead and take out a cosine squared x on the top, leaving me, if I take a cosine squared x out of here, I'm left with just a sine x. And if I take a cosine squared x out of here, I'm left with a minus 1. All over 1 minus sine x times cosine x. Now if I take a look at the top and the bottom, one thing I can definitely cancel out, now that I'm multiplying this by this whole thing, and I'm multiplying this cosine x by this whole thing, I can cancel out one of these cosines. And I'm going to do that first. So I'm going to get just a cosine x on the top times sine x minus 1 over 1 minus sine x. And then one thing that you should start to recognize is that these two expressions are very, very similar. Sine x minus 1 and 1 minus sine x. They are not the same because you cannot subtract in any order, but they're very close to being the same. if I want to change the sign of both of these and make this a negative sine x like the bottom and this a positive one like the top, I can factor out a negative 1. So on the top, I'm going to take out a negative 1 from here. And I'm going to put it in front of the cosine because I can multiply in any order. And I'm going to get a negative cosine x. And then that changes both of these. This becomes a negative sine x. And this becomes a positive 1. All over 1 minus sine x. Now, 1 minus sine x and negative sine x plus 1 are the exact same thing. The sign is negative, the 1 is positive. So now I can cancel out both of those. And all I'm left with is a negative cosine x. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, you can go ahead and click on the next example. So the try this for example 3 is its own separate video, so I can show you the steps for that.